going to go live with Professor K Satchidanandan, the prominent poet from India. We love his work. Anyone who has been following poetry, Indian poetry, it's unlikely that you haven't come across the works of Professor K Satchidanandan. So we will not only, I think he has joined. Let me just get him on the call. Hello.
Hello.
Hello, sir. Are you able to hear me?
Yeah, hello.
Yes, Professor Satchidanandan. Are you able to hear me? Are you getting my voice?
No voice. Yeah, hello. Yeah.
Hello.
Hello.
Namaste, Professor Satchidanandan. Is
Namaste,
my voice
namaste.
clear?
Yeah.
So good to be talking to you. It's a real honor and a privilege to be able to have this conversation with you. And
Yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah.
And special thanks to Niyogi Books for organizing this. We will start with conversation. I have a couple of questions, thoughts which I thought we would ponder over. And as we go along, the viewers who are watching this live session, they can ask questions. So to the viewers who are watching this conversation, you can ask your questions in the comment section, and I will be asking those questions to Professor Satchidanandan. So this is the book that we are going to discuss. This book is titled Positions, Essays on Indian Literature. This book is it's a collection of 25 of essays that Professor Satchidanandan has written over the past 25 years. So 25 years of writing in one book. How good is that? So to begin with, Professor Satchidanandan, tell us more about this book. How did this book come to being? And you have mentioned that these are essays written over the past 25 years. So I'm assuming these are the essays you started writing once you were in Delhi. Once you left Kerala, went to Delhi to become a part of the Sahitya Akademi Journal. And so, what is the journey behind the book and the essays that you have written?
I'm now in Kerala. I left Delhi when things were getting bad, and now I am actually in quarantine, so there are some restrictions. Yeah.
Okay. But what about the book? The book that positions the book that we are discussing today. You have mentioned that these are essays which are written over the past 25 years. So is there a Delhi connection there? It was about 25 years ago that you went to Delhi to join the Sahitya Akademi Journal, become the editor of Indian Literature Journal. So is there a journey behind that? Tell us the journey of these essays and how did this book come into being?
In fact, most of these essays were written after my moving to Delhi in 1992 as the editor of Indian Literature, the Sahitya Akademi Journal. And then, of course, as you perhaps know, in 96 I became the executive head of the Academy. And the essays began to be written, almost in 1992 when I moved to Delhi. And that was the time when I was developing a very serious interest in Indian literature, not only in my literature, in which I was always interested, but in all the literatures of India. And there were questions, new questions which are coming up at that time. For example, women's writing, Dalit writing, a lot of radical movements were taking place in literature at that time. And well, having a kind of political approach also to literature, I thought this was an important moment in Indian literary history, and I took no time to enter that and to try to understand other literatures. Of course, I was a reader of the journal Indian Literature. I have been a reader for many years, but it was after my coming to Delhi and actually engaging with a lot of Indian writers from different languages that I really, began to go deeper into the different literatures of India, understand and develop connections with the writers, and read translations of a lot of books in other languages, and develop a serious interest in what can generally be called a comparative literature, even though the term is very much debatable these days. Yeah.
Okay. In the book you have talked about, I mean, it covers a wide range of subjects, right? From the early canon of Indian text, from the Vedas to modern literature. There is a whole journey that you have covered in this book. Is there a, I mean, and of course you have also mentioned that Indian literature is not a monolith. Neither are the movements that were there. Maybe the Bhakti movement or the early poetry. None of them were monoliths. There were a lot of other philosophies that were working together, Sankhya and Charvaka and whatnot. But if you had to summarize, if you were to, I know it's a difficult task, and that's why only you can probably do it. But if you were to summarize the Indian literature into a single canon, how would you define it? What do you think? How is Indian literature different from the literature of East?
Yeah, in fact, I personally do not think we can evaluate the whole of Indian literature with a single canon. Because whenever we try to define Indian literature, we find a lot of difficulties and gaps. You cannot speak, in the same breath about the literature of Kerala and the literature of Northeast, for example. They are at different stages of growth, and it is true about many other literatures too. So I am more and more convinced that perhaps we need to use the term Indian literature in plural rather than in singular. There are certain common points. I have no doubt about that. I always quote, three people when I speak about Indian literature. One is Nihar Ranjan Ray, the great, scholar and critic in Bengali, who said there is no single language called Indian language, so you cannot have a single Indian literature. Then the second person was S. Radhakrishnan, a philosopher. He said, Indian literature is one, even though it is written in different languages. And I would say this was a typical Advaitic perspective, because Radhakrishnan was, an Advaitin, and so he would see a single, Brahma passing through all or the Paramatma passing through all the Jivatmas. But I am not very sure about this, even though this is the slogan of the academy. But I have always looked at it with a kind of doubt. In fact, I am closer to what your Anantamurthy once casually said, that when we look for the diversity of Indian literature, we come across its unity. And when we look for unity, we come across its diversity. I think this is a very meaningful dialectical statement, which sums up the unity as well as the diversity of Indian literature. Because we have had, common periods, shared movements, shared aspirations, and Indians do share a lot of ways of life, ways of thinking, world views. We have common epics. There are so many things that are common, but at the same time, if you look more closely, you will find even these movements found articulation in different languages in different ways. Kabir's bhakti was not the bhakti of Basava or the Tamil Shaiva poets, or Laldev, the Kashmiri poet, or one can go on to Chaitanya, to Namdev, to Tukaram. So now we think they all movements. But when you look closely at them, their identities were different, their approaches were different. They invented new forms of literature, and this can be said about every movement, which has sometimes cut across languages too. So I think we should take into account that diversity very much, especially at a time when Indian life, Indian literature, everything is getting standardized and standardized in a particular way. So I think we need to challenge that and emphasize this diversity, this meaningful, abundant plurality of Indian literature.
That was a very powerful statement. You are Anantamurthy's quote, very powerful. When you look at diversity, we come across the university,
Yeah.
and when we try to find the unity, we only see how diverse it is. Since you mentioned Bhakti literature, and the book has a lot of reference to Bhakti literature, there is a whole chapter on Bhakti, the first movement.
Yeah.
Of course, there is a chapter on Kabir. Can you share a little bit more about what your thoughts on Bhakti movement is? I mean, of course, the book has a lot, you have written in great detail about what Bhakti movement meant. But can you also talk a little bit about the social perspective? What led to the Bhakti movement, and what were its far-reaching results, and how did it impact the Indian society? If you could share a little about that.
Can you say that again? I think there's
Okay. So the book has you have written a lot about Bhakti movement, and
Yes.
they are brilliant chapters. I mean, very powerful reads. But if you can to our readers out there, to our viewers out there, if you can share a little bit about what drew you towards the Bhakti movement, what brought your attention towards the Bhakti movement, and what were the social implications of it, what were the reasons that led to the Bhakti movement, and what were the far-reaching outcomes of Bhakti movement that we are feeling even today. If you could share a little bit about that, about the Bhakti movement, and how do you see Bhakti movement as a canon, as a movement?
Bhakti was certainly a very radical mode of interrogation. We have a tradition of interrogation in all our literatures, and Bhakti and Sufi movements also belong to that tradition of interrogation, because they questioned the priesthood, they questioned the hegemony of Sanskrit, they invented new forms of literature, they questioned the caste system and the Varna system, and so I think several of our later movements also took off from Bhakti. And when we come to contemporary literatures, when we look at LGBT literature or women's literature or Dalit literature, we find the beginnings of many of these in the modes, in the ideas, in the values of these basic radical movements. So I try to relate what is contemporary with what happened in the past, even though there is no easy continuity between the old literatures and the new ones, but there is also a connection, a linkage, a continuity, and this is what I was trying to find out when I was discussing, Indian women's writing or Indian contemporary writing in general, the modernism in India and what happened after modernism, which is often called postmodernism, but even that appears in, with the different meanings in different literatures. So it is a question of connecting an understanding of tradition with an understanding of modernity. This is what I have been always trying to do in my own way from different perspectives. I wanted to tell you, I don't know whether I have time, just to say something about the title positions, because I use this title with quite a few meanings. One, positions, the title indicates geographical locations, different geographical locations within India. And secondly, social positions. The position in terms of gender, of caste, of class, these. And thirdly, positions in the sense of perspectives. So it can be a writer's perspective, a reader's perspective, a critic's perspective, that. And again, positions regarding the term in the literature, which we discussed briefly at the very beginning. And finally, linguistic positions, because there are some languages which claim to be national and some languages which are sidelined or they are simply called regional languages. While we have also English, which has joined this not cacophony but polyphony of languages, and so it is very complicated. And we are passing through a time when dialects are coming up in many literatures of India. Dialects in which literatures were not written before, like in Malayalam itself, fishermen's dialect, tribal dialect, they are coming up, and new literatures are coming up. Contemporary, very modern literatures are coming up from young people from these communities. So I think that linguistic positioning is also extremely important when we discuss Indian literature or literatures in general. So I had all these in mind when I was giving this title positions to this particular book.
Oh, it's a brilliant title for a book. I mean, it immediately draws you to the book positions, and especially when the chapters are so diverse. You have looked at the paradigms, and also you have looked at the different authors, ranging from the early bhakti poets to very contemporary poets like Namdev Dhasal and Kedarnath Singh. So that makes the book all the more brilliant. Uh, you mentioned how the roots for Dalit movement and women poetry movement can be seen in the bhakti kal. Uh, is the, I feel that the continuity is missing, because immediately after bhakti movement there is a decline in the bhakti movement, especially when we see the Hindi literature. We see that after bhakti movement we see a movement of Riti Kal, where there is a lot of romantic poetry. That suddenly the bhakti movement is on a decline, and there is a rise of more formalist and what to say, mannerism driven poetry. And then post Ritikal, we see the modern in Hindi poetry and other poetry movements take shape. And now we have reached a stage where again the women poets and Dalit poets are making a mark in literature. What do you think is the reason for this fall in between? And is there a way you can see correlations between the two, the Dalit and women writers of the bhakti movement and the Dalit and women writers of today? Is there a correlation between the two, or do you think we are going through a revival of a new kind of a bhakti movement that is happening over the past 20-30 years?
Literature has never remained the same. Any literature, take the history of any literature, and it is true, critics invent various kinds of names for what they call movements. I am speaking in the third person about critics, just because I am not very sure about all these labeling of various movements. The progressive movement, the modernist movement, the postmodernist movements. I think there is a lot of reduction happening in these labelings. They are very convenient to the professors of literature. I was also a professor of literature, and I know it's very convenient, and perhaps you need them to. I will not deny the need to name the movements. But when you really look at the text, go to the actual text, you find every text is very specific. Each text has its own way, or its own weave, its own construction, its own structure and message and meaning. And so you find that ultimately you come back to the text rather than the movements, even though they are named movements. But then, yes, if you want to have very general perspective on the evolution of Indian literature, you will certainly need, to name them. And so it is this continuous radicalization of literature that has been happening all through, right? As I said, from the Bhakti times to the LGBT literature, for example, which is perhaps one of the latest trends. So there is this continuous questioning, and all movements have contributed to this tradition of argument and of interrogation. And perhaps that is one common value that brings all of them together. Change is one thing that does not change, as we say, and this interrogation is perhaps central to our literary traditions. And there are ways of interrogation which we find in all these movements. That is perhaps one link that connects these different movements.
Uh, to the viewers out there, those who have joined the session, who are a part of this discussion, you can ask your questions in the comment section, and I will be asking those questions to Professor Satchidanandan sir. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask them. and I will be happy to pass them over to sir, whom we are interviewing today. Uh, Thank you so much, sir, for joining again. I mean, I want to thank you for this discussion. This is the book that we are discussing, Positions, Essays on Indian Literature, published by Niyogi Books. Uh, there is a brilliant chapter on translation, the last chapter of part one, where you have actually, I think, after it reminds me immediately of Walter Benjamin's essay, where he says, job of a translator, where he says that a translator is actually in breaking the paradigms of the language in which the translation is being made into the language in which the translation is done. So it actually questions what the language is capable of. So as a translator yourself, what draws you towards translating, the act of translating? I mean, what makes you translate such volumes of work? And of course we'll discuss more on translation, but as a translator you also, I want to start this conversation, your personal take on translating.
Translation has been another major area of my studies. There's only one essay here, but I have quite a few on translation. And I agree to a great extent with the Gayatri Spivak, who said that translation is a form of intimate reading. And in my own practice, I have found that translation is a very close reading of the text, which sometimes as casual readers we may not often engage in, because when you read a text and try to translate a text, you are trying to understand how the text was originally formed, constructed, imagined. So you are in some sense reimagining the text in your language. I mean, in the target language. So that's why Dilip Chitra, who translated Tukaram, once said, "No, you have to be a 20th century poet." I mean, he was writing at the end of the 20th century. At the same time, you have to imagine Tukaram in the 14th century and bring him to the 20th century without making him a 20th century poet. For that, you need an understanding of contemporary literature. You need a contemporary sensibility, but you also need to imagine Tukaram's locale, his position in his language, in the age in which he lived, in the whole Bhakti tradition, and so many other things. So translation is a kind of reimagining of texts, which needs a close reading, because you are going through each word, trying to find a parallel for each word. At the same time, the translation should also work in your language. It may look like a translation, all right. Walter Benjamin says a translation to read like a translation, because very often we praise a translation saying, "Oh, it looks like an original book. It doesn't read like a translation." But Benjamin says no. It should read like a translation. The reader should know that it was written in another time, or by another. It was in another language, conceived in another language. It should retain something of that strangeness. At the same time, it should be readable. It should be accepted by the readership as a absorbed into the tradition of the target literature. So it needs a very intimate understanding of both the languages, the language you translate from and the language you translate into. So, as a translator also, my practice has exactly been this. When I have translated a lot of poets from within India and outside India. So sometimes through English translations. But when I do, for example, Pablo Neruda, I have done a lot of 2 books of Neruda in translation. What I do is, I know a little Spanish, I understand. So I go to the original, I read the English translation, and then I translate, and then I sit with somebody who really knows Spanish, and then I compare and do that. So when I read a Neruda poem, say for example Makupiku, the Heights of Makupiku, I try to imagine how Neruda must have reached those heights, how he invented those metaphors and images, how he recreated those old times, and the whole great work that went into the making of Makupiku. So you have to transform yourself partly into Neruda and partly remain yourself. So that's why in a poem on translation, I have the translator is somebody who supports another's head on his body. So I have Neruda's head and I have my body, and that is how I myself, engage in translation. You have to be two poets at the same time. You have to be yourself because you are translating into your own style also, but you have also to be the other person so that you can imagine how he or she arrived at this particular text, this particular metaphor, this particular image. So it's a very creative activity. I've never looked upon translation as a secondary activity. I think it is as creative as what is generally called creative activity, and sometimes it requires even greater creative skill because you have to retain something of the original. At the same time, it should work in the language. So absolutely, that's why I always say only poets should translate poets. So I have seen a lot of professors just because they know the language translating, even poetry, daring to translate poetry. But I think only a poet can really translate another poet because they share a common language beyond the two languages to which they actually belong. The poetry itself is a language. Somewhere I have said poetry is the mother tongue of all human beings. So I think only a poet should translate poet, and translation involves a lot of imagination, as I said, the understanding of two languages, not only just the lexical understanding, but a deeper semantic and cultural understanding, because you need to know the culture from which the other text has come, and you should translate the culture into your own culture. So it's a very creative, very complex, and extremely meaningful activity. It has been so for me, and I'm sure it is so for every, can I say, good translator. Yeah.
Sachi sir, to be very honest, the first poet I mean I also write poetry. I don't know how good or bad that is, but I'm also interested in writing poetry. And the first poet I had ever translated was you. I mean, in 2011 I had translated your poem Bhrantan Mad, the Mad into Hindi, because I write in Hindi, and and now that you are mentioning the method, I had intuitively gone to the next Malayali I knew, and I had shown the original Malayalam text and the English text and my translation, and I had done the followed the same method. So now there are a couple of books that are out that are my work of translation. But the credit goes to you. The first time I had the courage of translating someone, or I felt like translating someone's poetry, I couldn't stop myself from translating someone's poetry. It was your poetry. So it's again a great honor to be having this conversation with you after so many years time. So yeah, thank you for that answer. I mean, it clarifies a lot of things for me as well as a translator, as an aspiring translator and a poet. Uh, there is one essay you have written on Kedarnath Singh. Kedarnath Singh,
Yes.
you have spoken about two of his poems, Kudal and the one about the truck that has broken down. And the interpretation of those poems are really good. They are showing how the kind of the alienation, the alienated societies we are living in, where the rural and the urban, the home and the outside, that those links are broken. Tell us a little bit more about what you feel about Kedarji's poetry, because uh, in one of his recent books, like the book before his last book, which I still consider his last book because his last book actually came out after his demise. There is a poem called Hindi, which he has dedicated to you, where he has written about the language Hindi, and this poem is dedicated to you. So I was always curious about the reason why he has dedicated a poem titled Hindi to you. Of course, I know that you speak good Hindi. I have watched one of your interviews with Dr. Purushottam Agarwal, where you have answered his questions in Hindi, and you speak very good Hindi. But is there a deeper connection between you and Kedarnath Singh that you feel that you would like to share? Tell us more about Kedarnath Singh, and what do you feel about his poetry, and as a person, as a poet, what do you think about him?
Yeah, Kedarnath Singh has always fascinated me as a poet. I have been reading him right from his first book up to Uttar Kabir and his latest poems. I mean, unfortunately, he's no more. He was one of my intimate friends. And in this particular analysis of the 2 points of Kedarnath Singh, as you already know, I have used Raymond Williams, some of the paradigms that Raymond Williams uses about the city and the village, how the city enters the village, and what is the relationship between the urban and the rural. And this is something I have seen not only in Kedarji, but a lot of other poets, who were born in small villages and who later moved to the cities. And that is my case, and that may be your family's case, and this could be the case of many people. So they have a kind of strange relationship with the city. They belong to the city, and still they don't completely belong. They also belong partly to the village in which they were born or brought up, or whose memories are still alive in them. And this village city contradiction and dialogue, that has constantly inspired me, that has constantly pushed me into new explorations, both in my poetry and in my writing on poetry. So that particular essay you refer to is a textual kind of analysis of two of his most famous poems, and I have done this also with some other poets like Namdev Tisal, quite a few other poets. I look at their text, try to look at their text closely, and find out the culture working behind them and the paradigms that can help us look at their works. Because I don't follow a single paradigm. In these essays, I try to find out what will suit what is consuming, or should I invent something new? Because I don't think we can just transplant a Western concept or even an ancient Indian concept, to Indian criticism and use it mechanically to explain. That's what a lot of academics do. They bring in Foucault, they bring in Derrida, they bring in all those major structuralist and post-structuralist thinkers and apply them mechanically to Indian texts. But there's a kind of resistance also in the Indian text to Western paradigms. And in the contemporary Indian text, not only to the Western paradigms, even the Eastern ones. You cannot simply quote, Dandin or Anandavarthan or Kuntaka and say that, okay, I will explain a poem by Kedarnath Singh or by Kumar Narayan or by Sunil Gangopadhyay or by Jay Goswami using all those paradigms. No, you may need to look at poetry afresh, because poetry is something that continually evolves, changes, and that is how it sustains itself. And so our yardsticks, the way in which we evaluate poetry, understand poetry, write about poetry, they also have to change similarly. So I'm not saying that we should invent a new, completely new, totally Indian poetics, because that would be very close to the Hindutva kind of understanding of literature and language. But no, I don't mean that. But we need to know that Indian texts sometimes also resist some of these theories, not only with those which come from the West, but which even have come from the East. And we should be aware of that, the resistance of the text to certain very strict, paradigms, whether in Eastern or Western. So that is when that you find only when you actually begin to enter the text and you look at the text closely, and you cannot explain it just by Vakrokti or Dhwani or by any concept of Foucault, or you cannot simply deconstruct it like Derrida did. So you may need fresh instruments to look at these texts and understand them. So, and that is the only way in which Indian criticism can grow, not by mechanically following whatever is happening in the West, but also looking at the Indian text very closely and looking at the ways these texts sometimes resist some of the theories, both from the East and from the West.
Okay. We have a question from Rajat Chaudhary. He asks, are the post-colonial Indian literature somewhat resistive to ecological fiction because of a different lens we use? Are the post-colonial Indian literature somewhat resistive to ecological fiction? I'm not very sure about what ecological fiction means here, but you might you will understand the question better because of a different lens we use. So, post-colonial Indian literature, is it resistive to ecological fiction because of a different lens that we use?
Uh, yeah, we also use the term post-colonial. You know, we have Homi Bhabha and quite a few theorists who have tried to theorize the third world literature and post-colonial. And here again, you know, we do not fall into the trap. It is true, historically, our present literature is post-colonial. But we need not look for all the signs of the post-colonial in our literature or in contemporary African literature. For example, you look at writers like Membe, who have looked at African literature from very native and very different kinds of ways. So it is true. There is an element of post-coloniality, which is historical, which is undeniable about us. But as I said, our post-colonial literature cannot be entirely be different from, or cannot be completely disconnected from what has been called pre-colonial literature and the literature of the colonial times. There are breaks, but there is also a continuity. Very much like what K Satchidanandan said, in the story about the axe. You remember the master or the person for whom the woodcutter was working asked the woodcutter, you said this axe belongs to your family, it has been there for generations, but haven't you changed the blade? And the woodcutter says, yes, I have changed the blade. Many people have changed the blade many times. But what about the handle? Yeah, the handle has been changed also many times. But the axe is the same. It looks very human, but it's also an extremely insightful story because it speaks about the apparent discontinuity, at the same time a kind of continuity. It is true. I am not Valmiki. I am not Vyasa. I am not even a 19th century poet. But there is something. Maybe I am not trying to essentialize poetry, but there is something, some element of imagination, something that is continuing also. And that's why we sometimes go back to our epics, to Mahabharata or Ramayana or some older 17th or 18th century poet, because we sometimes are able to talk to them. For example, I was during this lockdown, I was translating Kabir, and now I am finished with that. I'm finished in the sense, Kabir is infinite, but I mean it's enough for a book about 120 pages of Kabir. I've just finished translating. I've written an introduction and it has gone to press. So while translating Kabir, I did not feel I completely belonged to a different era and a different culture. I was talking to him constantly. I could converse with Kabir. There was this continuous conversation happening between Kabir, who was a secular spiritual kind of poet, which is something we perhaps need today to fight the kind of hegemony of not spirituality but communalism. So and Kabir is that way a great instrument to in that great battle we are fighting. And so I found a kind of continuity between Kabir and many of contemporary poets. Say, for example, Kabir and Kedarnath Singh, because one of his collections is called Uttar Kabir or Anya Kavitaen. Yeah, Uttar Kabir. He stands on the banks of that river where Kabir lived, and then he remembers Kabir standing from there as a contemporary poet from a contemporary point of view. So we have to look at also these connections and continuities. Even when we speak of the post-colonial, we are not speaking of a complete break, epistemological or aesthetic, but we are also speaking of something that is, that is coming into our literature from the past. So that is, I think we need to find also those linkages to understand contemporary texts and contemporary movements and contemporary trends.
Okay, okay. To the viewers who are watching this live session, you can ask your questions in the comment section, and I will be passing them on to Professor K Satchidanandan. We are very privileged and honored to have him with us today and having this conversation. So coming back to our discussion, Professor Satchidanandan, uh, what are your thoughts on the contemporary writing, the young writers of today, and what are the challenges they are going to face as they move into the as the 21st century matures, and now with COVID, and how the post COVID literature is going to look like? What are your thoughts on that? How are you going to what are the new paradigms that poetry is going to enter, and critical thinking and literary criticism is going to enter as we progress into the 21st century? What are your thoughts on that?
Hmm. Yeah, I think we need to work with multiple paradigms. We need to look at specific texts and specific traditions in the languages, and perhaps invent or discover the specific paradigm that would suit a particular text or a particular author, or sometimes that the particular linguistic tradition. So that's why I said I'm not for a complete and mechanical import or application of any European critical movement or critical paradigm. So I think we need lot of paradigm changes also, since new movements are coming up, like LGBT movement. In fact, we had gay poets. For example, in Urdu, we had a lot of poets who wrote what will today be called gay poetry, about their love for men writing about their love for men. But at that point of time, there was no, it was not called a radical movement or anything. It was taken as something natural. But later, because we made it unnatural and perverse, so we have to rediscover it as something very, very, very natural, something that is there even among the animals. So we need perhaps, to understand this new movement. We may sometimes need new paradigms, and also try to find out whether these people have predecessors. And that's why. So there was a feminist movement, but then the feminists also discovered a lot of ancestors who were silenced or who were not spoken about, who had already written, very assertive poems or stories about women, around desire, and so they had to invent them and connect with that tradition. And similarly with the Dalit movement, in Malayalam, the Dalit writers have discovered several 19th century texts which were deeply Dalit or imbued with a very profound Dalit consciousness, and they have connected with that. So this kind of an activity may be necessary to arrive at a proper paradigm where we have a radical movement, but we also try to find whether we could trace it to earlier movements and texts and authors, and we could, create a kind of connection between the older movements and the new movement. That may be one way of arriving at what I earlier called a kind of discontinuous continuity of Indian literatures.
Okay. There's a question from Kitab Khana Books. The question they're asking is, Sachida, what are your thoughts on translations becoming faithful to the original text vis-a-vis being a retelling? What are your thoughts on translations becoming faithful to the original text vis-a-vis being a retelling? Should the text be faithful to the original, or should it be a retelling?
I would. No, there is a kind of relationship between the original text and the translation, but it is not exactly an equivalent. I would not say the translation is, because there is a theory that translation is a kind of equivalence, but I do not think so, because that is why the same work can be translated in so many ways into the same language. For example, in English, you have so many translations of Odyssey or Iliad or Divine Comedy. From time to time, they produce new translations, and these new translations are done in a new language that would suit a contemporary sensibility, which is ever evolving, ever changing. So even if you think that this is the final translation that you have done, another poet may come and question this your translation, or at least through his practice, he would create another translation and say, I salute you for having translated this before me, but I have another way of looking at it, and I will translate it in my own way. So the relationship between the original and translation is not as simple as people seem to think. That it is not like word and you have a word and then you have a meaning. You look at the dictionary. No, that is not the kind of relationship. It is extremely complex because you are translating imagination, you are translating culture, you are translating semiotics, you are translating symbols, images, metaphors, and so as I said, it is also a reimagining of text, and so it's not a simple equivalent. So there is a very complex relationship, and but translations do enrich original writing in the languages. If you look at the histories of all our languages, we will find, we have had writers who were deeply impacted by translations of writers from other. If you look at our contemporary or recent movements, right from the progressive movement, they look at Zola or Balzac and quite a few, Victor Hugo, similar writers whose translations were available in the languages, and they inspired many of those writers. And this happened during the modern times also. Eliot was translated, Beckett was translated, modern novelists were translated. It could be Milan Kundera or Albert Camus or Jean-Paul Sartre, or recently Robert Bolaño or quite a few other people. And these translations somewhere, become a part of the target literature and also inspire a lot of original literature, which may not be imitations of those works, but which may have some elements taken from them, or which may have some kind of a quaint and oblique relationship with those translated texts. So translations enrich the target literatures, target languages. I have no doubt about that.
Okay. In fact, in the essay on translation, you have actually rejected the term original. You have mentioned that there is no original because it's always in a transition. You have taken the example of A.K. Ramanujan's essay where he has spoken about so many Ramayanas and how Ramayana itself has gone through so many interpretations and tellings. And so yeah, that's a very good answer. It's a continuously evolving process. Uh, uh, any other question that anyone else might have? I don't have any other question. If there is any other question you can that our viewers might want to ask, we can. Uh, so, Sachi sir, thank you so much for this session. I think the discussion we had today has enriched all of us, and all the best with your book on Kabir. We really look forward to. I really look forward to reading it. Is it a translation in Malayalam or have you translated him into English? What is the language of translation? The book.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, and thank you, Saurav, and thank you, Niyogi, for this wonderful dialogue. Yeah, my translations have mostly been from other languages into Malayalam, and also from Malayalam into English, and sometimes even into Hindi, sitting with another Hindi poet who knows Hindi better than me. Or I have done translations through English and through Hindi into Malayalam. I'm essentially a Malayalam translator. I'm a translator who uses Malayalam as the target language. So I have about now 3,000 pages of poetry in Malayalam translation, done over 50 years. And so my insights into translation have something to do with my own praxis and the kind of insights I go through my own practice. So I think it has been sort of a beautiful and meaningful dialogue. And thank you so much for your very insightful, very intelligent questions. And I hope I could respond with some insight and some meaning with all the kind of little experience I have in literature, criticism, and my own creative writing. So thank you, and I thank Niyogi for having given me this platform to introduce the book and having given me an interrogator or interlocutor who so beautifully asked questions and made the whole evening extremely meaningful. Thank you very much.
Okay, sir. Thank you. Thank you everyone for joining in. Thank you all the viewers for joining in. Thank you so much. Thank you.